that looks better. Okay, so unless someone's going to tell me otherwise, last week we basically covered these pages. We got to the top of page or bottom of page 1 in the first week when we were in the RPA. And then last week we covered this material, which was basically all of page 2, and we went through all of page 3. And if my recollection is correct, we stopped here. Somebody give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. I don't want to skip anything if I'm wrong. No, it's funny. I looked at this earlier with the team and I was really confident that's where we stopped. And now I'm second guessing myself. Actually, I don't think we did get to the bottom of page 3.
We did.
We did or did not?
We did.
Okay.
We
All
did.
right. Well, then guess what? If we're wrong, Veronica, we're blaming you. All right.
Okay.
So here we go. So we're going to start on the top of page 4. And here we are. So this is, again, we got a lot of options in here. So the CAR attorneys are attempting to make these forms, I don't mean to insult anybody, but I throw myself into this category, but attempting to make these forms idiot proof. And they only want you checking boxes and putting numbers in. They don't want us writing text and don't want us writing contract law. So we're going to run into some trouble there. So I think this is a nice cleanup from what they've done in years past. So depending upon what applies, of course, we check what applies. So we've got our property addendum, if any. So the first one we're looking at is the tenant occupied property addendum, the TOPA. So again, if we have a tenant occupied property, and the whole concept here is the tenant is staying after close of escrow. So if we have that tenant that's applying or staying, we're going to check box 4A in the top box, and we will go through the TOPA, the tenant property occupied addendum, in much greater detail later on in the course. We'll go through the whole thing. The probate agreement and purchase addendum, again, the PA.PA. We don't have a probate contract. So for those of you that are like, wait a minute, I thought there was a separate contract for the probate. Well, we did have a separate contract for a probate property. Now we don't. Now we're using the normal RPA and we're using the probate addendum. We will go through that addendum in detail. Manufactured home, same thing as the probate. We used to have a separate manufactured home purchase agreement. They've eliminated that, and they now are using the manufactured home purchase addendum. We will go through that in detail. It is kind of interesting. Just as a side note, recently we seem to have somehow stumbled upon a large percentage of manufactured homes that we have in escrow. As I'm going through SkySlope and taking a look at them, I see a lot of them. Appears as though our agents are figuring this out. And they're using the addendums properly. Tenancy in common purchase addendum. This is kind of an interesting one. I don't think I've seen one of these used in a very, very long time. Or honestly, I don't even know that I've seen a transfer of a tenancy in common. So let's go back and put our real estate school hat on. Okay. It's kind of interesting because I just had a similar, I don't know if Celia's on the call. I don't think she's been in any of our contract colleges. But I had what potentially could have been a use for a tenancy in common purchase addendum for Celia Chu. She called me a couple of days ago, and this was the scenario. She gave me 2 scenarios. What if we have a husband and wife, whole title as joint tenants, one of them wants to sell and one of them doesn't want to sell? What do we do? And the short answer is, well, unless they're getting a divorce and unless there is a court order that says, hey, we're the court orders the dissolution of the property and the partition of the assets. Unless there's that, then they got to figure it out. One party is not going to sell without the other. It's just that simple. She took the husband and wife out of it and said, well, what if it's like brother and sister, and one of them wants to sell and the other one doesn't? And that one's even trickier because husband or brother and sister aren't getting a divorce, of course. And she said, well, what if one of them got an attorney? I said, what are they going to sue for? You're not going to be able to sue unless there's a prior written agreement between the brother and sister that says, hey, we're buying it today and we agree to sell this property 5 years from now. And now on year 5, one of them doesn't want to sell. If that was the case, you could in theory go to court to enforce their contract from 5 years ago and says, hey, my sister doesn't want to sell, help me enforce this. And then the court could order that sale. Now, the example I'm giving you here with this tenancy in common is a little bit different. And what they're referring to there, guys, is how people are holding title to property. So we have husband and wife, joint tenants, right to survivorship, et cetera, et cetera. But let's use that exact same scenario that I just gave you, the brother and sister one, for example, and say, well, they're not holding title as joint tenants. They're holding, which, by the way, you don't have to be husband and wife as joint tenants. You can be brother and sister as joint tenants. Or doesn't even have to be any relationship. It can be Lance Martin and Andre Miles as joint tenants. Andre dies, I get his interest. I die, Andre gets my interest. But since Andre and I aren't related, or maybe we don't have that type of a relationship, it's like, well, if I die, I don't want Andre to get my interest. I want to give my interest to somebody else. I want to will it to my kids, or I want to will it to whoever I want to will it to. So that what we would do in that case is we would hold title as tenants in common. All right. So Lance Martin and a 50% interest, and Andre Miles a 50% interest as tenants in common. So this is fairly rare, but if that's how we did hold title, then now we would use, and let's suppose I want to sell my 50% interest, Andre doesn't. I would use the tenants in common purchase addendum. It was a long story to get to this addendum, but that addendum would be in place where you have one of the tenants in common selling their partial interest to somebody else. So I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this a long time and done a whole bunch of deals. I don't know that I've ever seen this happen. Normally what ends up happening in these cases is the tenant in common ends up willing it to somebody after the fact, or they end up selling it to the other tenant in common. So that's when that would be used. Stock cooperative purchases, we don't have a lot of these. These are more common up in Northern California and San Francisco Bay Area, so on and so forth. But if it was a stock co-op, like those condo conversions and stuff like that, this is what you would use. And then a mixed use purchase addendum. Again, I don't know that I've ever seen one of these purchase addendums used. If you're in that situation, you're going to know it. We will go through the MUPA. We'll give you some examples when we get to that one. And then the other, my goodness gracious, I don't know. It seems like they've listed everything possible. In theory, we could just have another addendum. I'm not even really sure what that would be. I'm assuming we might come up with that example as we move forward. Okay, other addendum, what can we be looking at? Well, this is just the old standby addendum number 1, 2, 3, 4. That is just that blank addendum, that one-page addendum that we in effect can use for almost anything. It seems as though at least once a week, I'll get a phone call from an agent and I'll say, hey, we're going to do this. Should I use an extension of time? Or, hey, we're going to do this. Should I use, what should I use? And I'm like, well, yeah, sure. You can use an extension of time addendum, or you could just use addendum number 1. Okay, create an addendum. They're basically the same. So this is kind of your catch-all addendum. If you're using an addendum as part of your original purchase agreement, which this is what this implies, I've written my 16-page contract. I didn't have enough room to do what I wanted to do. I'm using it. And by the way, this is different than a text overflow addendum. Let's go back a couple pages. Okay, here, let's suppose on the bottom of page 3, we're writing a whole bunch of stuff and we get to the edge of our third line and it doesn't work. The system will automatically create a text overflow addendum. I'm not a big fan of the text overflow addendum, guys, to be honest with you. They're perfectly fine and they're legal, but if you're, for example, writing a whole bunch of stuff and it doesn't fit on these 3 lines, and you do get to that point where, oh, guess what? We have a text overflow addendum. My recommendation would be don't write your additional terms under paragraph R. Go over here, check the box, create addendum 1, and then go ahead and write your whatever you're going to write, your 3 or 4 or 5 lines worth of text. Having said that, a minute ago, I said CAR has these things, and there's a reason they don't give us an entire page for us to write stuff. They don't want us writing contract. We are not attorneys. And the more words you start putting to the page and think you're smart and I think I'm smart and we're creating all this language, we're potentially asking for trouble. So basically your contract addendum, and again, keep in mind this is part of the RPA. So it would be highly unlikely there would be anything other than addendum number 1. If I saw one of these come through SkySlope and I saw this had addendum number 2, I automatically would say, where's addendum number 1? You don't have addendum number 2 unless you've got an addendum number 1. So it's kind of odd that they even gave us that option. Probably could come up with a reason or two as to why it would be something different, or maybe you want to label your addendums A, B, C, doesn't really matter. Okay, backup counteroffer addendum. If you're writing this offer and you're told specifically, hey, this property is already under contract, what are you doing? Why are you writing me an offer? It's like, I know, but we love it. We love it so much. We're going to go ahead and write an offer, and we're going to include our backup offer addendum, knowing full well that's where we're starting this process. If you're representing the buyer and you know full well this property is on a septic well or a property monument or propane, you are going to basically use the septic well addendum, and 99% of the time this is what you're going to use. Same thing with the propane. I'm drawing blank here real quick. Help me out here, guys, on property monument. Anybody have an example of that? I'm looking at that and I'm just drawing blank. Maybe we'll circle back to that, and when we get to the SWPI, maybe we can get into a little bit more depth with that. But in our marketplace, certainly going to occasionally need to use a septic addendum, a well addendum, propane addendum. In fact, I think today somebody on Leaper's Zillow Flex team needed a septic certification. So if you're in that deal, use the septic addendum. Buyer's intent to exchange addendum. I represent the buyer. I'm writing the offer. I'm letting the seller know at the time I'm writing the offer, this is a 1031 exchange. The buyer is exchanging into this particular property. Very simple form, and you, of course, will need to get that executed. The other, again, we can go crazy with that. Short sale addendum, be interesting to see if we start to see some short sales. I would imagine we'll have a few. So, when we're in the next sales meeting or a sales meeting and someone says, hey, I got a short sale, I'm sure everybody's going to lose their mind and say, oh my gosh, the market has changed and shifted. There will be a marketplace for short sales this coming year. I mean, we've seen anywhere from a 5 to 10% pullback in property values since last May. Somebody bought a property last May. Now they're getting divorced. They've lost their job. Something horrible's happened. They have a low down payment. It's entirely possible that property and that seller is a candidate for a short sale. And again, we will go through the SSA in detail. Court confirmation addendum. Normally this applies when you're doing a probate, or maybe there's a divorce order or divorce decree that says, hey, this property is being sold pursuant to a court order. Drew, you're unmuted. Did you want to jump in or?
Oh yeah, monument is basically like a survey tag.
Ah, there you go. Okay, so I got a quick story. I won't go too crazy with it. So I don't think Drew and I were working together. I think this was before he started working. I sold a house up in Ritchie Canyon, Northside Moreno Valley, and it was on a hillside, and it kind of went up, and there was a bunch of rocks, and I don't know, maybe an acre, 2 acres, I don't remember. And anyway, we sell this property, and this was one of those things. I was a listing agent, and it was one of those things when we sold the property. You look, and I definitely know Drew wasn't working with me because I was just a kid. And it was like, okay, well, where's the property line? Well, it goes all the way up this hill, and nobody's going to build on this hill. It's just a big rocky hill that goes, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet up to the top of the hillside. So where's the property? And you've got the little plat map, and you're looking at it, okay, well, it's that boulder over there, and then it's that boulder there, and it looks like somebody, put a little orange dot on it with some spray paint, and then there's a thing over there. Oh, and by the way, if you go up there, there's a property monument marker. Those are those little stakes that you see in the ground that have the little metal tab on the top, little surveyor stake, which, by the way, it's illegal to remove those. So if you're walking around somewhere and you find one of those survey markers in the ground, leave it there. It's against the law to remove those. So that's what those survey markers are. So you would use an addendum that says, normally this is not going to be used for 99.9% of the stuff that we sell, rural properties, acreage. Anyway, long story short on mine, escrow closes, I don't exactly know how long it took, but at some point, the buyer went to do something and realized that this property had a house and it had like a garage slash barn. And the garage slash barn, 3 feet of it was built on the other side of the property line. Okay. And it had been there for 30, 40 years at the time. Nobody knew, none the wiser. I'm not even sure how they figured out that it was built on the wrong side of the property line. This was before the city of Moreno Valley was a city. It was unincorporated Riverside County. Records get lost. People just do stuff without knowing it. Bottom line is, after that happened, they had a surveyor come out, and guess what they found? They found up on the hillside, they found a property monument marker, and it was exactly where it should have been. If we had crawled up the rocks and seen that, which was almost impossible to see, but if we had done that, we could have lined it up and said, oh, wow, we got a problem here. Just one of those things. At the end of the day, it was kind of a no harm, no foul. The buyer and the neighbor worked it out and whatever. So anyway, property monument marker. These are going to be larger properties, these funky ones. I will tell you guys, be very careful as the agent, when you're on those properties and the seller says, yeah, it's the oak tree to the left, and it's where you see the stick over there and the little orange paint on the rock. You stay away from that with a 10-foot pole. And if you represent the buyer, you're going to order a survey if that's something that concerns them. Okay, so there's our property monument markers. Okay, court confirmation, I think we just covered that. Seller's intent to exchange. Over here, we have the buyer's intent to exchange. Now, keep in mind who's writing this contract. This contract is being written by the buyer's agent. If you're the listing agent and you're not putting, matter of fact, Drew and I just did this, the property that we put in escrow, we were talking about the sales meeting, the seller, we represent the seller, is doing a 1031 exchange. I don't believe we put that in the MLS. If we didn't, is it the end of the world? No, but we probably should have. And then we certainly should have told the buyer and their agent, oh, by the way, this is a seller is intending to do a 1031 exchange. If we had done that in the MLS, if the buyer's agent's on their game and they're sharp, the buyer's agent would check this box, even if the buyer's not doing a 1031. Okay, buyer's going to buy this and move into it. But if the buyer's agent knows that the seller's doing a 1031, they should check this box, create the form SXA, seller's intent to exchange, and it's just nice and clean. Now, in the case that Drew and I just did, well, we didn't do that. Is it the end of the world? No, it's not the end of the world, but we just need to make sure, we need to get an addendum drafted. We need to let escrow know, and we just need to make sure that the buyer understands that, and frankly, our escrow company understands, and the seller understands what the rules are and how that works. For those of you that are new and you're like, well, how do the rules work? We'll go through it in more detail when we go over these exchange forms, but the gist of it is it has a zero impact on the buyer. So if the buyer's buying a property and the seller's doing a 1031 exchange, a lot of buyer's agents, they get nervous. They don't know what that means, because it's going to cost the buyer money, and there's taxes involved, and I don't want my buyer to have any tax issues. It has zero impact on the buyer when the seller does a 1031 exchange. And quite honestly, it's the exact same, only opposite. If a buyer is buying the seller's property and the buyer is doing a 1031 exchange, it has zero impact on the seller of that property. There just does need to be documentation on the contract and documentation in the escrow that one or both parties are doing a 1031. So we'll add those forms. And again, we'll go through those forms in depth. And I suppose we can come up with another if we think hard enough. So we'll get there when we get there. Again, these are automatically checked. I don't, in the old forms, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, in the old forms, when CAR automatically checked a box, the box was not checked with a blue check, that was checked with a black text or black check mark. To me, that was an easy way for me to sit back and say, because it's a black check or X mark and it's black text, that's a pre-checked box. I don't like that they're checking these and they're making them blue like everything else. That implies to me that the buyer's agent checked those boxes. So I am going to go to CAR next week, and I'm going to sneak myself into the standard forms committee, and I'm going to hopefully get educated, or I'm going to educate them. And they'll either say, yeah, Lance, you're right. And when we revise the form, we're going to make these black check marks like we used to, or they'll tell me why I'm an idiot and why they need to be blue. But nevertheless, these are
Yeah, it
by
used to be- it wasn't a check mark, or it was a check mark, right? Not an X.
well, it was, I don't know if it was an X or a check mark, but correct me if I'm wrong, guys, they didn't used to be blue. And the reason I.
No, it was just, there was a check and then it was a check mark actually, and then ours are X's.
X's. Well, right, because if let's
Yeah.
suppose I check the trust advisory, the REO advisor, when I put that X in there, it's going to be blue. That's
Yeah.
really, that's the point I'm trying to make is when I see a blue text, 123 Main Street, that tells me that that was typed by the agent. When I see a blue X mark, that used to tell me that the agent did that. So at any rate, I'm being a little nitpicky. But you know, it is different, I think, and no one's correcting me. So at any rate, just
Yeah,
know,
but unless the agent is sending you the contract in a colored format form, you're not gonna know whether that's coming over in blue or black anyways.
well, okay, but I don't know. I see them uploaded into SkySlope all day long with electronic signatures with blue text. So depending upon how those are getting to you, I mean, of course, if they're getting scanned or faxed or something like that, then of course we lose the color. But at any rate,
It doesn't matter, but it was, you're right, though. It was a check mark before.
right.
And now it's a blue X, but
Yeah.
I mean, those are
Well-
the standard ones anyway, so it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Mhm.
Well, just realize that these are in there by default. And I don't remember, I think Mike Soleil, I don't know if he remembers, there was in one or two classes ago, we were earlier on a different form, I think. And I said, wait a minute, this is checked. Why is that? And then I think one of you guys said, yeah, they're automatically checking them. All right. Nevertheless, like Drew said, I think at this point, at least with these 4 items, we've now kind of got accustomed to these 4 forms are always going to be a default. Okay. So the buyer's inspection advisory, BIA, we will go through that entire form later. The wire fraud advisory, we will go through that entire form later. Fair housing and discrimination advisory, same thing. And then the California Consumer Privacy Act. So we've already actually gone through these. I think we've gone through all of these except for the buyer's investigation advisory. Why have we gone through these? Because we went through these forms when we did the listing package. Okay, so they're there by default. Wildfire disaster advisory, we're using this a lot. I'm seeing this on the majority of our contracts now, and of course we will go through this one as well. Trust advisory, we're going to spend a lot of time on the trust advisory. When you guys are doing trust, buyers or sellers, it is almost invariably I get phone calls from the agents asking questions about a variety of things. Names. I mean, Misty and Chris have one. There was a trust within a trust within a trust, and each one of the names was like 45 words long, and it was just a total nightmare. And so I always get those. So we will spend a lot of time going over the trust advisory. We will spend some time going over the REO advisory. Who knows? Yes, there's going to be a foreclosure. I think we just closed escrow on one, or we were doing one with the homeowners association transfer. So you do need to be comfortable and understand what that means. We'll go through it. Statewide buyer and seller advisory. This is all, again, this is interesting. This is not checked. It's not required by law, guys. It's not required by law. However, I think almost every single brokerage now is requiring it for their file. I don't even know if we're requiring it for our file. I should probably know that. I do think we have it as a required form. Bottom line is I'm seeing it in every single file. It's just become one of these standard forms that we're asking for. Short sale information and advisory. This is a little different than the short sale addendum up here. If you are using the hold on a second, guys, I got to close my door. All right, a little bit of chatter in the lobby here in Moreno Valley. Okay, so if you're using the short sale addendum, you're certainly going to use the short sale information advisory. They kind of go hand in hand. It's another one of those forms where almost by default, I kind of wonder, why don't they just combine these forms together? Let's just make the information advisory part of the addendum. I know the answer to that. And the answer is this is a contract. The short sale addendum is contractual language. The advisory is not. So I guess I kind of answered my own question. Why do they make the buyer's investigation advisory separate from the actual RPA? Well, because it's not contract. It's basically a disclosure. So anyway, I just answered my own little issue there. short sale, and then a probate advisory. Same thing a moment ago when we were talking about up here. Where's the probate format? Oh, here we go. Probate purchase addendum. Okay. So when you have your probate purchase addendum, you will also have your probate advisory. Again, it's just that form that just kind of goes through and just gives everybody a little bit additional disclosure information as they go. Okay, so I don't see anybody unmuted. Let me check chat. I haven't looked in chat. Okay, I don't see anything in chat, so we're going to keep on rolling. Additional terms affecting the purchase price. Okay, buyer represents that funds will be good when deposited with the escrow holder. All right, so let's kind of deal with that first. I think I mentioned this back on page 1 of the RPA. If not, I'm going to mention it, or if I did, we're going to go through it again. So a couple of things here. This is super, super important. And as a matter of policy, this is how we want this to be handled at Coldwell Banker Town and Country. Okay. And I'm going to get to this actual sentence here in a second, but I'm writing an offer for a buyer. Okay. Let's say Alma is my buyer. In the old days, I was instructed as a new agent, and I may have instructed many of you guys years ago, that when I write that offer for Alma, and we determine how much the earnest money deposit's going to be, let's say it's 10 grand. When I write that offer, Alma needs to be prepared to write a check, okay, to Cobalt Escrow, or that she could make it to Coldwell Banker Town and Country, or any escrow, or Orange Coast Title. But bottom line is, we were instructing our agents to collect that check from the buyer. That's how we did it. That's how we had done it for decades. Too much trust fund problems, too many innocent, honest mistakes. A check got put in the file, a check didn't get to escrow before the 3rd day, it got into escrow on the 5th day. The contract never got accepted, but we still had this check in our hand, it was never returned. All of these issues, which looked at individually, are kind of no harm was intended. Nobody lost any money. Everybody was fine. But when the Department of Real Estate comes in and takes a look at these things, you are looking at a violation. Nobody wants that. So the industry, in order to protect ourselves from ourselves, basically said, we're not going to accept earnest money deposits from the buyer anymore when we write the offer. So in other words, we are not taking the check. We're not asking Alma, hey, Alma, give me a check for $10,000 and I'm going to hold it until we get the offer accepted. So if you're doing that, stop immediately. We don't want that. And quite honestly, the industry is accepting of that. So that being said, this sentence kind of sort of doesn't really apply as much as it did, because the thought with this was they have given me a check. And maybe when Alma gives me that check for 10 grand, she says, oh, I'm going to give you a check for 10 grand, but don't deposit it because I don't have any money in there yet. I will make sure that the funds are good when it's deposited. Now, the reality is, not only are we not collecting checks from the buyers at the time they write the offer, in most cases, escrow is not collecting checks. The default in the contract is to wire these funds. So best practice, guys, is we don't take any money. We tell Alma, hey, I'm going to let you know when your offer is accepted. And by default, you will be wiring these funds into the escrow company within 3 days from acceptance. It's going to be a wire. This used to be a bigger challenge. As an older person, they're not comfortable with electronics. They don't know how to wire. This is becoming less and less and less and less of a problem. But bottom line is, best practice is get them to wire it. If you have a client that just absolutely positively just doesn't have the means or the ability to do that, can they write a personal check to escrow? They can. I just don't want you touching it. Okay. So if they're going to do that, they're going to write the check. They're going to go to escrow. They're going to deliver it. We're not going to touch that thing with a 20-foot pole, because once we touch it, we have to account for it. Even if we only had it we walked from the lobby to the escrow company. Well, during that 30 feet that you walked from the lobby, that needs to go into a book. I had it in my hand, and then I gave it over to Summer at Cobalt Escrow. And if you don't do that, in theory, you're in breach. So initial deposit. So what are we looking at here? The buyer shall deliver deposit directly to the escrow holder. So there we go. That's my language. If a method other than wire shall be specified in paragraph 3D, we talked about that a couple of days ago. That's on page 1 of the contract. So if it's not going to be a wire, tell us what it's going to be, but make sure it's a wire. By the way, whatever that method is, it needs to be acceptable to the escrow holder. For example, well, I think this just happened. I don't know if it was one of you guys. Within the last month, somebody called me and said their buyer, they're doing like $150,000 down payment or down payment and deposit on a property. Well, half of their money is in cash. It's in a bank, but it's in a safe deposit box in the form of cash in the bank. And they want to use that money to buy the house. Like, well, I think it was 80 grand or something like that in cash. Like, well, can they take that $80,000 into escrow? And the answer is no. There's no escrow company on the planet who's going to accept, forget about $80,000. They're not going to accept $8,000 or $800 or $8. Nobody brings in cash. And the money laundering and, all that sort of stuff is what they're trying to avoid. So bottom line, cash is not king when it comes to moving money into an escrow. So in that case, if that buyer wants to utilize that $80,000, they're going to have to put that money into the bank, which of course they don't want to do that because they're trying to shelter it from taxes or hide it from the government or God knows what they're going to do. Along those lines, guys, if you have a buyer or a seller who has those concerns, and it's maybe they're not using the words, but it's pretty obvious that they're trying to hide some money and they don't want the government to know about it, and they don't want to pay taxes on it, whatever it happens to be, you might want to inform them that every single real estate transaction, whether you're the buyer or whether you're the seller, is reported to the IRS and the Franchise Tax Board every single time. Okay. So there's no way of getting around of that transaction being reported. So at any rate, you can't hide the cash.
Why do we have to fill out that stupid AS then?
Why are you causing trouble, man? We'll deal with it.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll shut up. We'll deal with that later. So yeah, we do our best not to practice tax avoidance as much as possible. Okay, increased deposit. We talked about, which by the way, I hate to do this, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Okay, so we're in 5A. We're on paragraph 5A of the contract. I think we're on page 4. I'm gonna go back, and I know it's not very easy to do this. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna make a quick reference to, let's go to the page 1 of, okay, so here we go. So this is page 1 of the RPA. Okay, so, and here we are talking about purchase price. We're talking about deposits. So when you see this paragraph number here, 5A number 1, all of these paragraph numbers apply to somewhere else on the contract. So we're referencing the initial deposit. 5A2, we're referencing the increased deposit. So if you're already familiar with the forms, then great. Yes, I'm pointing out the obvious, but we've got some newer people here. So when you're going through these pages and it referenced this paragraph, so this is what we're talking about right now in today's class. We're talking about paragraph 5A1, and currently we're talking about paragraph 5A2, increased deposit. Okay, so let's go back over here.
Yeah, Lance, what is that increased deposit? I never use it.
Yep.
I mean, I just put my initial deposit as my earnest money, and then the what's left out of it. Most of my buyers have been FHA, or
yep,
I had like 2 cash buyers, so I never even use that. So I don't even know what an increased deposit is.
Yeah, and you normally would not, but great question, and let's give you the answer. So if for probably 95% or 100% of the transaction, your buyer will put in their initial deposit, 5A1, $5,000, $10,000, whatever it happens to be, and that is their deposit. The rest of their money will be considered balance of down payment and closing costs. There will not be an increased deposit. So in effect, 5A2, going back to page 1, is going to be blank. You're not going to use it. So when would you use an increased deposit? So let me give you an example. Let's just suppose, Andre, you're the listing agent and this is $1 million property. I'm talking to my buyer and my buyer says, hey, I'd like to do a $30,000 deposit. I'm going to recommend a $30,000 deposit on this. The listing agents already told us in writing, Minimum deposit to be 3%. Seller will not entertain offers less than 3% earnest money. Okay, fine. Buyer says, dude, I don't have 3% right now. All I have is 10 grand. But if my offer is accepted, I can increase my deposit an additional 20 grand. And I can do that within, 24 hours or 3 days or 2 days after acceptance. So this will be one of those cases where initially the buyer doesn't have the amount of deposit that ultimately we believe is going to be requested, but the buyer agrees to increase it. Now, keep in mind, this is different than down payment and closing costs. And the reason it's different is because deposits are at risk, okay? Which is why if you're the listing agent, you want the largest possible deposit you can get. So the reality is, Andre and everybody, you're probably very rarely, if ever, going to use an increased deposit. I think I've seen it a few times, but normally it's a problem. And the problem is, if I'm representing the buyer, for example, I used to see this a lot, you'd see like $500 earnest money deposits or $100 earnest money deposit. And as a listing agent representing the seller, I'm like, well, this is not a serious buyer. we're not going to deal with this buyer. But again, not all markets are like they've been, where we have 20 offers, lined up and everybody's standing out and they're overbidding and all the rest of that. We will be back to a market at some point before we die, where you'll list a property, it stays on the market for 2, 3, 4 months. You finally get one offer in, and that offer comes in. It's a good offer, but geez, are you kidding me? This is a $700,000 property and you've given me a $500 earnest money deposit. Well, that's not much good faith. But this is the deal. I don't have any other offers, and I haven't had an offer in 3 months. So in that case, I might counter back as the listing agent says, fine, we're going to accept your offer and we're going to accept your initial deposit of $500. However, you're going to increase that deposit to $8,000 within 3 days. So at representing buyers, I will tell you though, you need to be careful with low deposits. It just sends a horrible message, especially in a marketplace where we have competing offers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, retention of deposit. Okay, this basically gets into the liquidated damages portion of the contract and what happens if there's a dispute. So let's just say we have Alma's my buyer and there's $10,000 in escrow and there's a problem. Alma's canceling, or that there's whatever it is. This escrow is not going to close. So paragraph 5A3 talks about the retention of the deposit. And then it refers us to paragraph 29, which is later on in the contract. I don't know if we're going to get there today, but if we don't get to paragraph 29 today, we'll certainly be there and we'll be finishing the RPA at the next session. But it refers to paragraph 29. Paragraph 29 is referred to as the liquidated damages clause, which is just a fancy term for saying the buyer and the seller are agreeing in advance what happens if there's a dispute over the deposit. Paragraph 29. Matter of fact, I think what we'll do is, Drew, do me a favor. Can you skip ahead and see if we actually have paragraph 29 in this presentation? Can you kind of do that on the side? And if we do, I'll go there. We might not even have that loaded on the presentation yet, but if we do, I'll go find it. If we don't have it, then we'll talk about it next week. So, but paragraph 29 basically says, if it's initialed by the buyer and seller, both parties have to initial paragraph 29. They don't initial paragraph 29, this doesn't apply. But if they both initial it, what they're in effect, they're saying is it's part of the agreement and it talks about what's the remedy in the event the buyer defaults. Buyer defaulting in this particular case, Alma just changed her mind. Nothing in the contract. She just said, screw you, I don't want to buy this house. Well, she has $10,000. If Alma did that and the buyer defaulted, okay, for no reason laid out in the contract, it's not a contingency, it's just a whatever, I've changed my mind 2 days before close of escrow, maybe I've already removed all my contingencies, the property's appraised, everything's great. What this says is Alma's $10,000 is at risk and buyer's $10,000 deposit per paragraph 29 is going to be forfeited to the seller. Drew, you're unmuted, did you find it?
Negative on 29.
It's not, okay, we'll get.
Yeah, you get into it when you get to that, right?
Yeah, we'll get there I was just going to skip ahead, and then when we got there, we'd be done. But
You do a whole class on that thing.
Yeah, true. And you're right. And when we get to paragraph 29, we're not going to do an hour and a half on it, but we're going to spend some more time on it because it's important. And a big part of why it's important is, I get this, and again, I get this question regularly. There's a problem. Okay. The deal is not going through for whatever reason. And depending upon who you're representing, it's like, well, is my buyer going to get their deposit back? Or if he's a seller, is a seller, well, is the seller going to get to keep the deposit? Well, the answer is it depends. And part of what it depends upon is, did they agree to paragraph 29 and what sort of impact that has? So we'll get into more detail when we get to paragraph 29. It does refer to statutory liquidated damages. By the way, wherever you see the word statutory, that's law. So by law, by statute, the liquidated damages falls within that particular clause, and it gives you a civil code and all the rest of that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and retention thereof. If it's an all cash offer, as specified in paragraph 3A, going back, okay, there's no loan required. The offer is not contingent on the buyer obtaining a loan. Okay, and the buyer shall deliver the verification of funds per paragraph 3HA. So a 3H1. So if you have a cash offer, make sure that they've got proof of funds, make sure that that cash is available. Be careful. Sometimes you do have buyers who have all cash, but the cash isn't liquid. It's in a 401k, or it's in a retirement, or they were in a car accident and they're waiting for a settlement. Man, I used to get those all the time. Oh yeah, I'm getting a settlement. Oh, great. They make it sound like they're getting the money tomorrow. And so, okay, well, what's going on? You're going all down this path only to find out they have no settlement. They've got an attorney and they think they're going to be millionaires, but they're not. So make sure that cash is not, and let's use a more realistic one. They have the money. They show you a thing from Solomon Smith Barney that says they got $3 million in the bank. Cool. Well, you've written this at a 5-day close escrow. Okay. Can you get that money liquid from your 401k management company in 5 days? In most cases, probably not. So make sure you've got that covered. Okay, I'm going to keep on rolling. Loans. Okay, so here we go. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to get a loan. Okay, so if we're getting a loan, the first loan, this loan will be provided for conventional financing. The default means it's a conventional loan unless we basically check the box, we're doing FHA, VA, or seller financing. So the default in the contract says I'm doing a conventional loan, 20% down, 10% down, 5% down, 50% down, anything other than FHA, VA. So that is the default. Additional financed amount. If an additional financed amount is specified in paragraph 3E2, that amount will provide for conventional financing unless the seller's financing addendum is checked. So what are they talking about there? We don't do these very much anymore. I haven't seen one or done one in years, but we used to do a lot. For those of you old timers, we used to do loans called like 80, 10, and 10. Okay. And 80, 10, 10 was I'm going to get an 80% first trust deed, C1, first loan. I'm going to get a 10% second trust deed, C2, additional financing. And then the other 10% is going to be my actual down payment. So these were, I don't know, they didn't really seem all that creative at the time, but they served a purpose. They almost don't exist. I don't know if anybody's done anything similar to this. I don't think these have been offered in forever. But that would be a very good example of an additional financing. Now you could get weirdly creative, and guys, don't always assume that we're financing in traditional methods, meaning we're going to get a first trust deed through Wells Fargo or Bank of America or ABC Mortgage. Okay. These contracts cover all of the possibilities. For example, maybe I'm going to get a hard money loan. I'm going to get a first trust deed from the Norris Group. Okay. And that first trust deed is going to be at whatever interest rate. And maybe it's a 60% loan to value. Okay. And then I'm going to get a second trust deed, additional financing. And I'm going to get that money from my brother. Okay. And it's also hard money. He's going to charge me a larger interest rate. And then I'm going to put the rest in down payment. So that's what they're referring to here. For most of you doing normal financing with your buyers, you're not going to have an additional financed amount. If you do use seller financing, the seller is going to carry back a second for however much money. We will use and we will go over the seller financing addendum. I'm telling you guys, if you start, well, I'll give you a little word of warning. If you call me and say, Lance, I'm going to do a seller finance deal, can you help me out? And you haven't actually read the seller financing addendum, I'm going to tear your head off. I will of course help you, but I'm going to tell you first, go read the seller financing addendum. I don't know how many pages it is, but it's a lot. Okay. Not overly complicated, but you need to kind of at least know what you're getting yourself into. We will cover the seller financing addendum before we finish our class today or this session. Not today's session, all the sessions. Buyer's loan status. Buyer authorizes seller. You guys listen to this? The buyer in the contract is authorizing you, the seller, and the seller's agent to contact the buyer's lender. Okay. They're telling us up front we can do that. So when you call that lender and you're not getting straight answers, maybe you might want to remind them that, hey, the buyer's authorized me to do this and I need to get some information. The sad truth is most of our listing agents are not even making the phone call to the lender. Make that phone call, get that information done. If we are talking FHA or VA, if those boxes are checked, you must use the amendatory clause, the FVAC. If you don't use that form, and if you don't get that form signed by the buyer, and you submit this contract to the buyer's lender and underwriter, and they don't see that form, you're going to have a problem. That form has to be signed with the same date that is on the offer. So if you don't get that form signed and you're going to get that form signed, 2 weeks later or 30 days later, and that date is different, an underwriter could, I'm not saying that they will, but an underwriter could basically kick the whole thing out because that FVAC, a mandatory clause form, must be given to the buyer and signed at the same time they're writing the offer. Otherwise, we're, I want to use the correct term. I was going to say violating. That's probably not correct, but we're not giving the buyer the ability to have all the information they need to make a decision to write the offer to begin with. So make sure you get that in front of them when they sign their original offer. Also going to deliver that to the seller, CAR form RR. That's a request for repair. AEA, help me out here. Does it tell me what an AEA is? Why I'm drawing blank on an AEA. If anybody knows Drew, what's an AEA?
I don't, I'm gonna look it up right now.
Drew's gonna look it up.
Addendum to existing agreement.
What is that?
Addendum to an existing
Oh,
agreement.
addendum to, okay, thank you. There you go. So, so again, we're going to deliver an RRR, or in effect, what they're saying is it's entirely possible. I don't know why they're specifically calling this out on an FHA deal or a VA deal, because this could happen in any deal, in any transaction, conventional loan. You could have an RR, request for repairs. I need an RR. This is what, I need that. You could have an addendum to an existing agreement. Okay. Keep in mind, just like an RR, whoever's drafting the addendum to the existing agreement or any addendum, that has to be agreed to by both parties. One party just doesn't have the ability to say, hey, I'm gonna modify the agreement. Lender required repairs. These are things that are always kind of come up, not only on FHA VA deals, they can come up on conventional deals as well. We don't worry about them so much on conventional, but bottom line, with a lender required repair on an FHA transaction, if those lender required repairs don't get done, that property's not getting done. Those are things like the appraiser will go out. A typical one that we use as examples all the time on FHA deals is the FHA appraiser goes out and the paint's peeling on the fascia. Well, the guidelines say that you can't have any peeling paint on the fascia, typical stuff. So if that's the case, that has to be done. You're not buying that house without it. Another one that can come up on all transactions, whether it's FHA or conventional, is things that we put into the contract that alert them to it. The appraiser didn't see anything, but we said something. So for example, we put in the contract, seller to credit buyer $5,000 to repair roof or for future roof repairs. You put that type of language in a contract, And even if you counter it out, no, seller will not pay $5,000 to credit buyer towards future roof repairs. That language is in the contract. An underwriter is going to see it. I don't care what kind of financing you're doing, the chances are very good that underwriter will say, there must be something wrong with the roof. They don't necessarily going to want $5,000, but they're going to want a roof certification. Hey, give us a 2-year roof certification or whatever it happens to be. So be very careful when you start inserting repairs language into a contract. So again, we'll go over the RR, we'll go over the FEAC and the, the additional, what was that again, Javier? Additional something addendum?
Amendment to an existing agreement.
Oh, amendment to an additional. So we'll go over that. But keep in mind, when we pull that form up, it's going to be blank. It's just going to be an addendum and whatever we're going to put in there. So we'll go through that as we get there. Okay, balance of purchase price and down payment. I'm going to refer back to Andre a minute ago. So Andre says, hey, my buyer puts in the initial earnest money deposit. He's like, what's this additional deposit? What are we doing? I'm not used to that. Normally they put in their $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000, and then we're getting ready to close escrow, and the escrow company says, hey, you need to bring in another $7,255. They bring in the additional $7,255. That's what this is referring to. That's what paragraph D says. It's the balance of the down payment and or additional funds that are in effect required to close. Okay, so that's what they're referring to here. Simple math. I got $1 million purchase price. I put down $100,000 down payment, or excuse me, deposit. I'm getting an $800,000 loan. I got another $100,000 I got to figure out. Escrow is going to say, bring us in the balance of your purchase price, your down payment. Oh, and by the way, you got another $22,000 in closing costs. Bring that in as well. Okay. And that's how 99% of our deals go when it comes to that. Okay, limits on credits to buyer. We discussed this back on page 1. And if you were really paying attention, I said, we're going to address this later on in the contract. This is that later on in the contract. So if on page 1 or anywhere in the contract for that matter, buyer and seller agreed, seller agrees to pay 5% of the loan amount to be applied towards buyer's closing costs. It's a big amount, right? Well, if you ask for 5% or 10,000 or 30,000 or whatever you asked for, and that is a larger amount than what is allowed, if allowed credit, the lender allowable credit. So if that amount is larger than what the lender allows, then guess what? The lender's not going to allow it. And they're going to say, well, sorry, Charlie, this loan program, the maximum amount of allowable credit is 3%. That 2% additional, which could be a lot of money, you can't use. Okay. And if you read through this, it basically says that accrues back to the benefit of the seller. So in other words, the buyer doesn't get that 2% to be used somewhere else. All right. So don't embarrass yourself as the buyer's agent. Go in and think you did a great job and you got a gigantic buyer credit or seller credit towards the buyer's closing costs or whatever it happens to be without talking to the lender first. It hasn't happened recently, but man, there seemed like we had a slew of these that were coming in previously. And it always seemed like every single one of these, our agent was the one who represented the buyer, and our agent did not check with the lender before they went through this. So that's what they're referring to here. So just make sure that whatever that credit amount is, it's going to be allowed by the lender. Pretty basic stuff. Okay, rolling into the bottom of page 4, additional financing terms, verification of down payment and closing costs. This is just saying, hey, here's my proof of funds. My proof of funds includes everything I'm going to need, including the closing costs in order to make that happen. So for most of us, this is just going to be a bank statement from Wells Fargo or whatever it happens to be that says, hey, we've got this covered. Verification of loan applications. Okay, the buyer has done the loan application, has delivered evidence that they've completed a loan application within whatever this time is in paragraph. So whatever we said in paragraph 3H3, we have to do it within that period of time. So we've either already done it and here's our information, or at the time we wrote the offer, we said we would provide proof, verification that we've taken the loan application within 3 days. Pretty straightforward stuff. And of course, buyers and sellers initial the bottom of page 4, and away we go. Buyers stated financing. Okay, I think we used an example on this last week or possibly the following week, previous week rather, where we were talking about the buyer changing something in the contract. And I think our example is they wanted to assign it to their trust or whatever it happens to be. And there's language in there that says they can do that. Or maybe they wanted to assign it to a third-party buyer that they had nothing to do with. And well, that has to be approved. The seller has to approve that. This is a similar conversation. And the buyer stated financing, this first sentence really kind of summarizes it. The seller is relying, okay? The seller relied on the fact that you said you were going to do a 30% down payment conventional financing, okay? That's what you said. And because you said you were going to do 30% down or whatever the specific thing was, or it was non-contingent or whatever that thing was, the seller said, I'm accepting your offer for that reason. And if you unilaterally, buyer, change your stated financing, in other words, well, I don't want to put down 30% anymore. My lender says I don't have to. My lender says I only have to put down 5%. Okay. Well, the seller relied on the 30, not the 5. And the seller's going to have a problem. I'm going to have a problem as the listing agent. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a minute, Lance, we're still going to close on time. Nothing's going to change. The seller's going to still get the same amount of money. And it's not going to cost them anymore. And we're still going to close on March 1st, whatever it happens to be. No harm, no foul. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. So again, the buyer should not and cannot just unilaterally change his financing. Now, let's talk real world. Occasionally, real world intersects with the hard and fast. I want to hold the buyer to it. And when you find yourself in these situations, let's use some common sense. The buyer needs to change financing for the following reason. Okay, well, let's talk to the listing agent. Let's go through the reading, get the lender involved. Let's make sure we know what we're doing. Let's confirm, hey, we can still close on time. Hey, it's not going to cost you any more money. And in many of these cases, you can make those changes. Okay. But again, just don't think it's just a unilateral, the seller can just do it. As you can see in this sentence, the seller has no obligation to cooperate with the buyer's efforts to obtain any financing other than that specified in this agreement, but shall not interfere with the closing of the purchase price. So again, you've got some language in there that says, hey, let's do it, but let's use some common sense. Let's use some common sense with that. And I go to war over these. Having said that, as a listing agent, sometimes I go to war over it. You calm down, you go, get a drink of water, talk to your seller the next day. You're like, all right, talk to the lender. They're still going to close here next week, whatever. But then you always run through that. Well, that's baloney. We should have taken the cash offer and, we were worried about this. And of course, where this really becomes a problem is everyone's agreed to it. They make the change. And then 2 days before close of escrow, you find out the buyer ain't buying the house anyway. And those are the ones that are just so aggravating. Okay, closing and possession. Occupancy. Buyer intends to occupy as a primary or second residence. See paragraph 3E3. It's funny. We just had one of these. I was on a conference call with a client who just acquired a property that we are now managing. And we closed escrow a couple of weeks ago. And on this call, this client admitted to me that I wasn't involved in the purchase or anything like that, but admitted that they purchased the property owner occupied, and they apparently had no intention of occupying this property as an owner. That's loan fraud, so that's what we're talking about here. All right. So if the default is that they're getting owner occupied financing, then they're getting owner occupied financing. We're not contributing or cooperating or aiding or abetting any buyer that's getting a low down payment property that they know darn well they're not going to occupy. They're going to put a tenant in there. So be careful. So that's what we're talking about here. If it is tenant occupied property, it refers back to the TOPA form again, the tenant occupied property addendum. And all that sort of good stuff. Condition of property on closing. I love this paragraph. This paragraph has been in the contract as it's written for as long as I've been an agent. And this refers to as this is what I call the as is or in present condition portion of the contract. You know, occasionally you'll, I don't know, I haven't had this in a while, but I'll have an agent, oh, well, you can't sell properties as is, or you can't sell the property like that, or you've got to clear that up. No, we absolutely can sell properties as is. We absolutely can sell them with liens, and we can sell them with violations from the city, and we can sell them with, you know, substandard conditions and red tags and notices to abate. We can sell anything we want as long as we disclose it. And as long as the buyer understands after close of escrow, all of that ugliness that they're dealing with a lien or with a solar panel or with a notice to abate from the city or whatever it happens to be, all of those headaches now become the buyer's headache. So the as is present condition addendum, it's been there forever. It hasn't changed. It includes everything on the property. The only caveat to it is you can't sell something as is, but not disclose what the as is. Okay. You know, you've got to disclose that issue that you know about. So, so again, it's the default in the contract. I kind of go around, and I'm not suggesting don't do this, but I will tell you it's not necessary. A lot of listing agents, when they're writing counter offers, they'll put language in. The house is a disaster. It's a mess. And this listing agent, I see Andre, give me a second. Let me finish my thought.
Okay.
And the house is a disaster, and the listing agent, we just can't help ourselves. We can't help ourselves. And we, in our counter offer, we want to put in here, buyer and seller agree that the property is being sold as is in its present condition. You know, seller will complete no repairs, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, if it makes you feel better, great, put it in there. Quite honestly, I'm sure Drew and I have put that in there more than once. And reality is it's not necessary. It's right here. Paragraph 7B, it says the same thing. Now, if you're like, well, Lance, I want to put it in for emphasis, I understand. And I do that sometimes. So there is nothing wrong with restating in a counter offer, buyer counter offer, seller kind of restating things that are already in the contract. You will occasionally get other agents that will give you a pushback and, you know, hey, you know, idiot, it's already in there. Why am I doing? Well, I'm doing it because I want to make sure. I want it to be crystal clear. So you don't have to, but it's there. Okay, keep on keeping on. Oh, by the way, Andre, I'm sorry. What did you have? I blew past you. What do you got?
So my question was, Lance, is let's say, for example, that you know a property is in a little bit of a rougher condition, like I'm getting ready to take on a listing in Rialto. The property has a roof leak, the fascia needs to be painted, and they don't have like an AC converter, you know, that thing in the closet that when you turn on the AC or put on the heater, it like switches the unit on. They're missing that.
Okay.
But and I felt like it's going to disqualify like some FHA buyers, because I know like
It will.
they have to have a property in a certain standard. But
Yep.
let's just say, for example, I got some of those things fixed prior to me listing it. Would I still have to disclose it?
Yes, you have to, well, 3 or 4 different things there. So first of all, you absolutely can sell that property. If I had it handy, I'd pull up some pictures. You know, Drew and I sold a property on, I think it was in San Bernardino on 4th Street or something like that. This house was a tear down. I mean, it's I've never seen anything like it before. It had all sorts of everything on it. We sold it. But to your point, yeah, you're missing the FAU unit, the forced air unit in the closet. It's gone. Can you sell it as is? Yes. Are you going to be able to get FHA financing? No. VA financing? No. Are you going to be able to get conventional financing without a furnace? Probably not. Now, wait a minute, Lance. I know you can. Well, okay, with a large enough down payment, but even on a 20% conventional, if you don't have a heater, it's completely gone. The appraiser is going to go out and say there's no heater in the house. Put the heater in. Maybe on certain programs, no. But so yeah, it's going to exclude all those financing. So you said, hey, wait a minute, we want to get it fixed prior to. Yeah, so you get it fixed prior to. When we get to can't remember which addendum it is. It's one of the seller addendum, one of the disclosures. One of the items on that disclosure, which we will be talking about at a later class, talks about repairs that have been done to the property. Okay, so when you're doing a repair like that, even though the repair is done, you absolutely have a duty to disclose. And it does kind of sort of fall into this as is area. I have fixed a problem. I'm telling you I fixed it, okay? And in part, you want it, number one, you want to do it for the obvious reasons. You want, hey, the buyer, well, guess what? We just put in a brand new forced air unit for you. But that buyer may say, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. You put in a new forced air unit, but did you replace the condenser outside, or did you do this? So they might want to take a closer look at it. You might want to say, well, let's take a closer look. Was this repair done in a proper fashion? Or is there potentially other issues? Maybe a better example that could be a red flag for a buyer is you did a roof repair. Okay, well, we want to look at that repair. Was it a little repair? Was it a big repair? Maybe we need to do the whole roof. So bottom line, Andre, yes, you're disclosing that. 100%. And we'll talk about that when we get to
Okay,
that.
thank you, Lance.
You're welcome. Again, let me go back. We're continuing here. So we're on paragraph 7. We did A and B. Now we're continuing to, oh, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Okay, I'm sorry. Paragraph 7B1. Now we've got paragraph 7B1 and item 2. Okay. So again, buyer is strongly advised to conduct inspections to the entire property in order to determine present conditions, et cetera, et cetera. This is the type of language that a lot of agents, myself included, will put into a transfer disclosure statement, which you're not, by the way, don't do that. But one of the reasons you don't have to do it is because it already says it. It says in the contract, buyer is strongly advised to conduct investigations of the entire property in order to determine its present condition. Seller and agents may not be aware of defects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This language is there. And again, it has that nice little kind of protection for us as well. Not only is the seller potentially not aware, we may not be aware. We don't know. Get that inspection done. Very, very important. And also it goes, even deeper. Building codes, compliance with law. Is it up to code? Did we get a permit for the patio cover? All that sort of stuff. Okay, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. So we're talking about our seller in possession form, SIP, or the RLAS, residential lease after sale. So that's what refers back to paragraph 3M2. And it in effect talks about what happens if we are dealing with the property where the sellers remain in possession. What does that mean? What do they have a license to stay on the property, or is it a short-term or a long-term? How does that work? So when you have a seller in possession, I'm not going to go back there, but if you go back to page 1, I think it's near the bottom of page 1 on the RPA, it gives you those options. Is the seller going to stay in the property less than 29 days? Is the seller going to stay in the property more than 30 days? Use form SIP, seller in possession, use form RLAS. At close of escrow, seller assigns buyer any assignable warranty rights for items included in the sale. This is one of those things that buyers sometimes get excited about, but generally speaking, it doesn't really go anywhere. So what they're talking about here, let's use Andre's example. Hey, we just replaced the forced air unit. Okay, well, does that forced air unit have a warranty? Is that warranty transferable? Well, if it does have a warranty and if it's transferable, it's the seller's responsibility to give that documentation over to the buyer. This, by the way, has nothing to do with like home warranty or home protection plans. This is talking about warranties that are in existence at the time, appliances, that sort of stuff. Seller shall on close of escrow unless otherwise agreed to, even if the seller remains in possession, even if the seller's in possession, buyer said, hey, you can stay for 2 weeks. Even under those circumstances, the seller is supposed to give keys, passwords, all of that stuff to the buyer on day 1. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it's a fight. The seller says, well, I'm not giving you keys. I got 2 more weeks. Okay, well, that's not what the contract says. Now, the reality is this is something that gets overlooked. Nobody seems to give a rip. And the seller generally will turn over all that stuff when they move out of the property. But maybe the buyer wants to do some stuff. Hey, man, I want to start cleaning up. I want to go tear out some landscaping. I want to do this. If you've got that sort of stuff in your buyer's mind, get all that stuff in writing. Make sure that the seller understands, hey, yes, you're going to remain in possession. However, the buyer's going to come in and start doing things, which quite honestly can be problematic. They have a seller that says nonsense. I don't want to be disturbed in the next 2 weeks. Okay, keep it rolling. Contingencies, removal of contingencies. So our first one we've got here is the loan contingency. For 95% of the transactions you guys are going to do, a loan contingency will remain in effect, and that loan and contingency will remain in effect until it's either removed, or in most cases, well, I don't know about most cases, but in many cases, it's not removed and literally until escrow closes, meaning that CR form was never done. Okay, so loan contingency, the agreement is, unless other, so by default, this agreement is contingent upon the loan's approval, unless it's specified otherwise, or a contingency removal form has been attached when the offer is written. Not normally the case. So it's contingent upon the buyer obtaining the loans. If it is contingent, the buyer has to act in good faith. If the buyer just says, I think I've changed my mind, I'm not going to provide the information to the lender, I'm not going to pay for the appraisal, I'm not going to do any of that stuff. Well, the buyer is not acting in good faith. Some buyers are looking for a reason to get out of a transaction. Well, there's a million reasons they can get out. There's no reason to drag your feet and lie. Basically, buyers can cancel the contract for any reason they want, except for maybe like, I changed my mind. Okay. That is not a good reason. That would be a reason if your buyer says, I changed my mind, tell the seller I changed my mind. It doesn't say in there you can change your mind. But what it does say is, I don't like the crime. I don't like the neighbors across the street. I heard an airplane fly by, whatever. Okay. Or more reasonable. I did my home inspection. There's all sorts of issues. I can't get my loan. The appraisal came in low. I found out the bedroom wasn't permitted, whatever, those type of things. So these contingencies on the loan have to be met. And the buyer has to act diligently to do that. If there's no appraisal contingency, or if the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure of the property to appraise for the purchase does not entitle the buyer to exercise cancellation. So in other words, they disconnect the loan contingency from the appraisal contingency. That's just the way it's been since ever I've been in the business. Now, dependent upon the loan, dependent upon the buyer, dependent upon a lot of things, the appraisal, it can be the hang-up. The buyer qualifies for the property, but the property doesn't appraise. The appraisal comes in low, or whatever it happens to be. So we've got our loan contingency in place. I'm going to point out paragraph 3 here. Buyer's contractual obligations regarding the deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies of the agreement. So what they mean there is, I've got my loan approved, but then somehow, somewhere, the money I was going to use to do the down payment and closing costs, I don't have that anymore. Okay. Well, your loan's approved. At some point, somebody verified that you had $80,000. Now what happened to it? Oh, I went out and I bought a car, or I loaned it to my brother. I don't have it anymore. That is not a contingency of the transaction. This happens periodically. It's nothing more frustrating than you're getting to the finish line and all of a sudden the buyer's down payment money disappears. If there is an appraisal contingency, removal of the loan contingency shall not be deemed removal of the appraisal contingency. Again, they're separate. Okay. So if I say, hey, my loan's approved, I'm good, I'm solid. I got full loan approval. Okay, well, that's cool, but the appraisal hasn't come back yet, which is kind of odd. Generally, you're not, there is a disconnect between those, but in most cases, lenders aren't going to even issue a full loan approval until the appraisal's done. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe you'll get that in advance. But anyway, the bottom line is, if you did remove the loan contingency in advance, you could keep the appraisal contingency in place. If there is no loan contingency at all, you're going to check the box. That's going to be on paragraph at 3L1. I've checked the box. This offer, this loan is non-contingent. Okay. I'm buying this house. All right. Be very careful if you do that. Just want to make sure that that's the case. What happens if it's not the case? Well, however much my earnest money deposit is going to be at risk. Very well may lose that if I blow this deal up because of that. My appraisal contingency, again, by default, unless specified other, it's almost the exact same language on the loan contingency. The property must appraise at the contract value. If it doesn't appraise at the contract value, then a variety of things happen. Buyer does not have to go up. Seller does not have to come down. It can just be, I'm sorry, I don't want it anymore. Or of course, what we attempt to do is, let's try to figure out, if we can't get someone to come up or come down, can we meet in the middle somewhere and try to figure this out? Sometimes we have success, sometimes we don't. If there is no appraisal contingency, it says exactly what it says. Be careful with this though, because if you're waiving appraisal contingencies, appraisal comes in low, you may have some issues with that. And, you know, depending upon the type of financing or whatever it happens to be, that in itself could be a problem. You know, you can't waive that appraisal contingency. So just be careful. Normally, when you have a buyer who's waiving appraisal or loan contingencies, these are fairly well-heeled buyers. They're fairly sophisticated buyers. They feel very comfortable with their finances and their credit and their income and all the rest of that. Or they just really, really, really want the house and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it done. This is another one of those which is checked by default. So under the appraisal, the Fair Appraisal Act, parties acknowledge receipt of the Fair Appraisal Act addendum, form FAAA. Okay. Hey, Andre, you're unmuted.
Yeah, Lance, I thought you only could waive an appraisal contingency if she was doing it all cash.
No, you can waive appraisal contingencies.
So how can you waive an appraisal contingency if a loan that's backed up by a bank like a FHA or even a conventional loan is funded upon them knowing how much a property is worth?
Well, what happens in most, if not all of those cases, is the buyer is going to, let's just suppose the appraisal comes in $10,000 low. Okay. Well, the buyer needs to come up with 10 grand. So if I'm waiving that appraisal contingency, and let's suppose my lender says, well, hey, you know, tough, man, it appraised low. We're only going to loan on this amount. We're not going to loan on the higher amount. Well, the buyer now has to find the difference. They have to find that $10,000.
Is that what's called an appraisal gap?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that term. It's funny. I think, matter of fact, I think the first person I heard that from was you. It's not a term that I use generally, but yeah, it makes sense. It's a gap in the appraisal. You know, that's kind of a term that I think is associated with cars. You know, hey, my loan, when I traded my car, I got a gap on my vehicle. But yeah, we got a gap. Our contract price is 500. The appraisal came in at 580. I have a $20,000 gap. Nobody wants to pay it, but I removed the contingency. My lender says, well, that's great, Lance. But we're not going to loan based on 500,000 anymore. We're now going to loan based upon 480. You got to come up with that 20 grand. So it happens every day. Yeah, I did that on my house, on the house that I bought. The house that I bought a couple of years ago, the appraisal came in, I don't know where it was low, not much low, but it was lower than what we agreed. And seller and I came in and we kind of sort of split the difference a little bit. And I'm not sure exactly how that impacted my loan, but if it did impact my loan and I had to bring in more money, I was going to have to bring in more money. Yep. Now, but you got to be careful with that. So if you're in that situation, this is another one of those things. The first couple of pages of the agreement, you cannot fill those out independent of the buyer's lender. Okay. You have to have the buyer's lender on the phone. They have to be involved. You have to tell them what you're doing. And they might sit back and say, wait a minute. No, you can't do that on this particular financing for this particular reason. Okay. So when we're unilaterally making these decisions, we got to be careful because there might be other people. Like, for example, I said, hey, you can sell any house you want as is. Well, you can sell any house you want as is to the correct buyer with financing that fits that particular property. You know, I can't sell, and you, Andre, you just gave the example. You're not going to sell that one house without that forced air unit. Can I sell it to somebody? Sure. Can I sell it to this buyer with this type of financing? No. So that applies to everything. It applies to everything we're talking about here. So again, be careful on the appraisal contingencies. Again, if you find buyers that are just hell bent on this house, just make sure they've talked to the lender. The lender's on board. Everybody knows what they're doing. They understand the risks. They understand that the deposit may be at risk, and everybody comes in with eyes wide open. Okay, investigation of property. This agreement is, again, as specified in paragraph 3L, contingent upon the buyer's inspection. So, and it's a physical inspection. Maybe it's a termite inspection. Maybe it's a roof inspection, a septic inspection, an electrical inspection, whatever we want to call it. They have the ability to do all of these inspections. And unless it's specified otherwise, the buyer has the ability to do these inspections and throw up a red flag and say, I'm not happy with the condition or whatever happens to be. Review of seller documents. This agreement is specified in paragraph 3L is contingent upon buyer's review and approval of seller's documents. Well, what are the seller's documents? Well, everything listed in paragraph 14A, which we're going to get to later, but what is that? Well, it's a transfer disclosure statement. It's the homeowners association documents. It's their SPQ. It's the, hey, the seller disclosed that there was a murder in the house. All of those things have to be reviewed and approved by the buyer, and the buyer ultimately can say, I'm disapproving the seller's documents, whatever those happen to be. Okay, I don't see anybody unmuted. We're going to keep on rolling. Title, okay, as specified in the agreement, it's paragraph 3L. It's contingent upon the buyer's ability to obtain title policy, okay, and basically review and approve the prelim. I've talked about this in SkySlope training. I've talked about this in sales meetings. One of the things that I will hold back a closing check for you guys, we've been talking a lot about AS and QS and all the rest of that, but there's another one. Most of the time you guys are great about getting it, but if at close of escrow, we do not have the buyer's approval of the preliminary title report, we're going to hold your check back. We want the buyer's approval of the prelim, which is, title. That's what we're talking about here. And 99% of the time, it's all pretty perfunctory, nothing fancy in there. A buyer, unfortunately, in so many cases, don't really even understand what they're approving. And maybe their agents didn't do a good job of explaining to them, but we want them to know. An example that I've used in prior trainings is many, many years ago, there was a house out in the east end of Marina Valley, and it's one of those properties. It's just north of the freeway and large lots. I think they're 1.5 acre, 2 acre lots, nice single story ranch houses. And one of these properties had like a tiered lower level to it. And the buyer who bought that property wanted to, I think it was either a swimming pool or a tennis court, wanted to do something down at the lower level. That was their intended use of the property. Main reason they wanted to buy this house, and they had all these great plans, et cetera, et cetera. So they close escrow. They're getting ready to put their tennis court in. They go down, they pull up from the city, and the city says, well, you can't, that's a floodplain. You can't do anything with that. You can put grass on it, you can mow it, you can, put your dogs down there, but you can't build any structure on it. That was on the prelim. That was on the prelim. Nobody looked at it.
Lance, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a question for you. This is the first time it happens.
Okay.
We're closing escrow and the title company just sent a plotted easement
Yep.
on a lot of the house that I'm selling.
Yep.
I've never seen this. So could you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, no, because I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Sure. But
It's for public utilities.
okay, all right. Well, and that's very common. So, and we will review an actual prelim at a later date in this class. So there's a public utility easement. So every single property, by the way, every single property that you're ever going to sell, well, I don't know about everyone, but certainly residential houses, have public utility easements. You can't do anything on the first 7 feet of the property. You can't do anything on either side of the property line for 4 feet in. You can't do anything on the back of the property for 8 feet in. And they're for exactly what you would think. There's a utility line, there's an electric line, there's a gas line, there's a water line, and they don't want you building anything on top of that. If they ever have to get in there and service that gas line, they don't want to have to tear out your concrete or your shed or your swimming pool. So those are super, super common. It's
Okay.
in effect the same kind of thing that I just described. I don't know if it was called a public utility easement. I believe in my example, it was basically a floodplain, and you weren't allowed to build there. So, but those are the type of things that really, really need to be looked at. In most of the houses that you guys are going to sell, those type of easements are very small, a couple feet here, a couple feet here. And it's like, hey, no big deal. Yeah, I can't build my swimming pool all the way up to the property line. I wanted to build, well, most people realize they can't do that anyway. But then you run into others. And you're like, well, shoot, there's, whatever it happens to be, there's a gigantic drainage ditch underneath my house or whatever. Well, not only can you not build, on 2 or 3 feet of the property line, you can't build anywhere. in the backyard, no swimming pool for you, no tennis court for you. So very common stuff though, Veronica. The bottom line is all of those easements of those natures, most of the time, it's all written in very plain English, super, super easy. You just read it and it'll tell you, you can't do anything within this many feet of the property line or, so on and so forth. So if it doesn't read that easily, email it over to me. We'll take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So those are the type of things on a prelim that you got to keep an eye out for. CCNRs, some sort of special regulation. You can't park a RV in the driveway, whatever it happens to be. Those, and by the way, those don't always jump out at you on a prelim. A lot of times the things that are of a concern are mentioned in a prelim, but they require additional research. You've got to go get a copy of that document. You got to get a copy of what it's saying. Hey, this project is subject to the following recorded document by Lennar Homes. What is Lennar Homes doing? What did they do that now affects my property? Well, it'll give you the document number. You pull that up, you go to the title officer, and they'll give you that 32-page document that says, oh, these are all the things that I have to comply with. What do we got here? Buyers 5 days from receipt. So if contingencies have been rolling, and everything's been removed, but they still haven't received a prelim, or they still haven't received the seller's disclosure documents. Well, all of those dates that the buyer had to approve things, those just keep getting extended and extended and extended because they haven't received the documentation in a timely fashion. Is it a condominium, a planned unit development, PUD? I don't know where they, looks like they took the word unit out of there. But you got a planned development. A lot of times I just used in the acronym PUD. It's a PUD, planned unit development. You'll hear CID, common interest, again, disclosures. You'll also hear common interest development, CID. That are very common acronyms that we use within the industry when it comes to properties that are in homeowners associations. Condominiums or homeowners associations, PUDs, planned unit developments, homeowners association, very common stuff. And they're all governed by a common Sterling Davis Common Interest Subdivision Act, which is what this Civil Code section 4525 means. So all of those things apply. Generally speaking, it's pretty benign. Obviously, most buyers and sellers continue on with their transactions after these documents are delivered, but occasionally there's something in there. Well, I'll give you one. I don't even think this is enforceable anymore, but we got sued, I think, 3 different times. I don't know that any of them actually went to trial. I think all went to E&O, but there was a period of time, and if someone knows the answer, help refresh my memory. But there was a period of time previously where if you purchased a house in Moreno Valley Ranch, you could not rent that property out for a year. Well, we did that. We sold 3 properties over there, and every one of those we probably sold more than 3. We sold a bunch of properties, but in 3 particular cases, the buyer immediately went to put a tenant in the property. Homeowners Association came back, said you can't do that. Fines were exchanged. Mediation was exchanged. It was just a disaster. Now, the law subsequently changed, which in effect prevents these. I just answered my own question. A law changed a few years ago, which prevent the Homeowners Association from drawing those type of rent restrictions. But there's some other things there you got to be careful of. Very, very important stuff. Read the documents. Buyer review of leased or liened items. The example that we generally use, and I realize it's 1:30. Let's just get through this paragraph and then we'll pause here for the day. The leased or liened items are the example we generally use are things like solar panels. Okay, so hey, I've got the big solar panel thing. I don't know if Iran's on the call. I don't see Iran, but I just went out on a listing appointment with Iran last week. We're walking around the property. We're doing our thing. We're getting ready to list it. We go out. This just happened a week ago. This is a true story. All my stories are true, by the way. I look up, there's solar panels. Oh, you have solar panels. I'm talking to the seller. I'm talking to them. I'm like, okay, great. Hey, what's up with the panels? Do you know, do you own those? Are they leased or are they liened on your tax bill? Oh, I don't know. I think we own them. Yeah, we own them. No less than 10 minutes later, we kind of circle back to the solar panel issue. And then the same seller who a minute ago implied that he owned them said, oh yeah, we haven't made a payment on those either in a while. They would have been behind on their mortgage payments. and which is why we're selling the house. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, just a minute ago, you implied that you owned them. Now you're telling me you haven't made a payment. Well, my wife used to do that and she passed. And well, anyway, we went from, yes, we own them, to 10 minutes later, we haven't made payments on them. These are leased solar panels. So those need to be dealt with. And if the buyer's going to assume those leases or those liened items, the liened ones are those hero program things that we talked about. They show up on a tax bill. Buyer needs to approve all of those. We use solar panels as the example, but just understand it's not just limited to solar panels. There's a lot of other things that this could apply to. Okay, it is 1:32. I think we're doing pretty good. So we're going to stop here. What page does this put us? Oh, wow, that's funny. Hey, Drew, did you put that slide there, or did that just magically happen to stop where I wanted to stop?
I moved it there like 5 minutes ago.
Got it. Okay, so I know we're only on page 5, or actually, I guess we're on the top of page 6. We're going to start accelerating this. This portion of the contract, it does take a while to get through. And then as we start going through a lot of the disclosures that reference back to these things will hopefully start to fall in place. So I feel pretty good. We're on pace. Obviously, we still have 5 weeks left. I don't know if we're going to finish in 5, but we're gonna do our best. So I will pause for a second. Anybody got any questions, comments? I don't see anybody in muting. I don't see anything new in chat. And so I guess we're good. All right, guys, go sell something. Market's getting hot though. I'll tell you what, I'll leave you guys on a positive note. I ran the numbers for January. They haven't quite settled in. Listings are down. That was probably the biggest disappointment. I expected the listing count to be higher than it was. We have fewer listings in January than we did in December. That did surprise me a little bit, but the pendings are definitely up. I'm seeing it. The lenders are seeing it. We're feeling it. Our numbers are improving, and there's some reasons to think, hey, you know what, maybe this difficult patch we've been going through with these interest rates and buyers abandoning the market,